Morgan, can you just help our listeners get to know you a little bit, talk about your family and some of your passions?
Yeah, we were just sharing before this, Jeff. The passion of my life is to be a son of God. I've learned him as Father, and that came later in my Christian life. And I call it my second great conversion, of which I feel like I've had 3 in my story. But to become a son has changed everything. C.S. Lewis says, I believe in Christianity like I believe in the sunrise. I believe in it because I see it every day, but it's by the sun I see all things. And in some ways, I think when you ask that question, I realize like to become a son is my sunrise. I believe it because I've experienced it to be true. To unlearn God as Father the way I've learned him wrong, and to open my heart to receive him as the true Father he intends to be. And it's by that I see all things. So the treasure of my life is to be a son, and therefore to grow as an apprentice in the kingdom, and to have a growth mindset, a beginner's mindset, looking for wisdom's long view. So from that place, the greatest treasures I've been entrusted with is my bride, Cherie, 20 years, and my son, Joshua, who will cross over 16 next week.
Yes.
My little princess, Abigail, who's still a beautiful enigma to me. I cannot figure out what makes her tick. But I'm after it, and I'm going to keep trying, and I'm going to come to the center of her heart, but I am not doing that great. And she turns 13 tomorrow. And Jeff, when this all started, I guess that's to say I was a young man, in oversimplifying terms. I was passionate. I was thirsty for life. I grew up in a loving home that did not have God. It did not have a view of reality that was God-centered, and therefore a loving dad that was largely gone. It was really up to me. And so my life was about trying to answer my soul's question as a man through the biggest story I could find. And so I won that game: leadership, women, sports, and I lost my soul. And I came to a crossroads where I found a man at 18 years old that looked in the mirror and knew I lost my soul. And I won the game. So it must be God. But everything that smelled and tasted of God that I saw was unattractive. It simply wasn't synonymous with life. And so I went to college on a pursuit for God. I went hunting. And what I found was that I was the one being hunted.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that at the time because I was still an orphan, but I gave my life to God. It was a radical conversion. But over the next several years, Jeff, what I realized was that even though I had trust in God, obedience to God, forgiveness from God, I still was uninitiated. I still was scared. I still had these questions. How do I become the kind of man that can be a loving husband one day? How do I become a loving father? I dream of being a dad. I dream of being a husband, and I'm paying all this money to get this education, and no one's talking about being a dad. No one's talking about being a husband. Like, where's the school for that? Like, literally, there should be a school to fix a car and become a husband. And I'm learning economics and human and organizational development and philosophy. And where is that school? So that's a good question I found. And I found it in Colorado. And over the last 20 years, I entered a process where God became my father, my pastor, my guide. And I entered a slow and steady process of being initiated as a man and fathered as a son. And so where I find myself now, in just a moment's statement, is in process of over 2 decades of making my life about becoming the kind of man in whom God is glad to entrust more and more of the care of his kingdom, becoming more and more honest about what's not yet, about what is under construction. Yeah. But that used to feel like a weight, and now it feels like a promise because there's so much hope.
Morgan, when you talk about your kids and your wife as treasures, I can see in your eyes, because we're able to look, even though it's through a screen, like there's a glow from the way you talk about them. And
Yeah.
I read what you wrote. I believe it was you that wrote it about your wife on your website, and you described her as the chief life officer of your domain.
Yes. Yes, she
And
had to have a title that gave the
yes,
dignity to all that she does. And so
yes.
I came up with that because it was the closest thing to name it, right?
Well, I mean, it popped off the page to me because our mission is to add life to the dad life. And you've
Mhm.
said you've lifted up with the power of words and identity of the chief life officer in your wife. And I believe that's what we all want as dads is for us and our spouses to be these life, like we bring life to our families. Can you tell me a
Yeah.
little bit about what you mean by being the chief life officer?
I think I think the most authentic way to get into that question, um, Jeff, there was a time where I had grown enough, healed enough, matured enough to get honest about how much pain I cause the people I love the most. And I think in our brokenness, in our self life, our self saving, our fig leaf, our caricature, our way of self protecting, we we start with a very dim view of ourselves, of understanding what our impact is. My motive, I would have told you, was to love my wife. And even early in our Christian life, I tried to champion her. I remember like little things, like saying, our first year of marriage, I don't think I've ever shared this publicly, but one of the things I said, Cherie, you can do whatever you want, but my one ask is that you only work part-time, because I want to protect the space for you to generously explore what it's like to be a wife. I want to bless you with that space. And so that was my heart. But it wasn't until we were in a counseling office, 10 years into our marriage, where I thought things were going really well. And I was actually excited, finally, for the first time in a counseling session, be excited to be there. And this couple turned to Cherie and said, "How are you doing?" And she just started crying. And I looked at her, and frankly, I was pissed. My first reaction was like, "What are you doing? Like, we were fine. Like, I'm fine. You're fine. What?" And out of the piss was just this anger of the striving to be a good dad, to be a good husband, be a good man. And she said, "I feel like a bird locked in a cage, and I can't fly." And Jeff, I just, tears come to my eyes as I tell that story, because that wasn't my heart's intention at all. I dreamed about being a loving husband, but the fruit was that was a broken man, an unhealed boy inside a man that was still driving to get his question answered by achieving. I am loved when I come through. I am loved when I achieve. And now it's just in the name of God. It's just in the name of being a husband. And all the while, my strength wasn't actually rescuing the beauty. It wasn't actually fighting for her. It was actually diminishing the glory of her life. And so now I really, I've done the work. I still have much more to do, but we're so much healthier than we were a decade ago. And now I believe wholeheartedly that there are three people in our marriage. There is me, and there is my bride, and then there's something I just call our we. It's our union.
Yeah.
It's the youngest of the three, but it's growing, it's maturing, and it's a force. It was a sapling, but now it's a young tree that has enough support that it doesn't have structure to help hold it up. It's standing on its own terms now, which is not where we were a decade ago. And I believe one of the greatest in sacred trust given to me is to champion her calling and to allow her to thrive as the chief life officer. And so that's where I see us today.
Yeah. A few minutes ago, you said something about finding your way to the center of your daughter's heart, and it's
Mhm.
a pursuit. Could you unpack a little further what you mean by that?
Yeah, you have three daughters, so I need to ask you that question.
Oh boy.
And I will get back to you in a moment. But yeah, to honor that, um, my son, I'll start with my son because the day he was born was not the day we anticipated. We dreamed of a natural birth. We went to these hippie-esque classes. We were going to go no meds. And this was our first kid, so we had it all planned. And her fluids were low. She had to be induced. She had to get drugs to be induced. Then she had to get drugs because of the drugs to get induced. And in a moment, we went from our dream birth to her looking like the back of one of those old computers with like 8 or 10 wires coming out of her. And I'm going, what the heck is this? This isn't my story. I don't choose this. And hours of labor. And I needed a break, and God bless her, because I'm sure she needed a break, but I needed a break. And I took a walk, and in the quietness, God said, "Who's in charge?" And that was an honest question he was asking me. And I said, "You are." And he said, "Whose story do you want for your son? My story or your story?" And that was an honest question, Jeff, because at that point, I didn't know the answer to that. Because I think I would have told you I wanted God's story, but my actions revealed I wanted mine.
Yeah.
And on that day, that hospital, Penrose Central, I said, "God, I agree with your story for my son. And I want to participate with what you have planned for him. I want to participate with your initiation, and I'll participate with the birth story you have." And God began my parenting with this radical shift that God is very interested and motivated in the initiation of our children. It's what makes him come alive. He has their best interest in mind. And when I put down my agenda, I got curious. I got responsive. The path that my children have chosen and God has chosen for them is not what I would have chosen in so many ways. But being a student and being attentive and participating has changed everything. So now turning to Abigail, my daughter,
Yeah.
she is an entirely different creature. I believe gender matters.
Mm.
We bear the image of God as man and as woman. So she is a feminine creature of which much I do not understand.
Right.
She has a temperament that's very different than mine. And so I do believe that God has given me some shape, some guidance of her initiation. We're holding these universal questions that I believe every human being has to wrestle with in their journey from childhood to adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
And I am shepherding and I am offering my unique strength and temperament. But largely, I approach her with a question of, Holy Spirit, would you show me her heart? Who did you make Abigail Rose to be? And how do I bring my delight to her and communicate consistently?
Hmm.
Abigail, you are loved.
Yeah.
And there's nothing you can do or not do and say or not say that will cause me to withdraw my delight.
Mm.
And if I can get that right, then everything else becomes secondary. It's bumpy. I'm missing it. We're going into a birthday tomorrow that I am fumbling over at her at 13. I just confess,
Yeah.
like, Jeff, I feel like I was in step with Joshua at 13. Like we were just boom right there. With Abigail, I am blundering, but my heart's in, and I'm not going to withdraw my delight.
That's that last thing you said. My heart's in. I just believe it's far too easy in frustrations or confusion for us dads to take a step out, because we're like, oh, we just got to gather, we got to figure it out, or maybe the next phase I'll be able to re-engage, but to choose to be dads who keep our hearts in and
Totally.
leaning in. So I love that, and thank you for just taking a moment to explain that it's not, you don't have it figured out at 13.
Right. No. And Jeff, I'd love to flip back to
Yes.
you. Like, yours are younger, but you have 3. I just want to take my shoes off and go, you are outnumbered. You are a man outnumbered in need of God. But what
Yes.
have you learned? Like, what have you learned about her heart?
Yeah, to me, it's closeness. And I say, look me in the blueberries. I don't have blue eyes, but my middle daughter Ruthie has blue eyes. I'm like, let me see your blueberries. So get eye to eye. Show me your brown berries. I told my other 2 daughters they got brown berries in their eyes, and I want to see them. And to me, that closeness, whispering, like I have something I want to whisper to you, bringing them in close. I'm in that season of closeness, and then of course the play, the delight. My litmus test is if their eyes are shining, it's a good chance that my eyes are shining. But as soon as my eyes have
Oh,
stopped shining, then I've just got to ask myself what's going on, under the
yes.
hood. And but I actually, I mean, your question back to me leads to, again, I want to talk for a second about building versus taking time to tend to the foundation and the excavation.
Yes.
And I just
Yes.
think I'm stumbling in this area of I'm trying to build this chapter of fatherhood with a 6, 3, and 1-year-old. I'm building current intentionality here and here. I'm working. I think I'm too tactical. Far too often I'll forget that there's a foundation that's really important before I work on
Yes.
building. I know this is your heart passion here. So
Yes.
can you
It
talk
is.
about that concept for a little bit?
I think what I would offer is that for 22 years, if there is one question that's the most consistent question I've been asked by far by men, is how do I initiate my kids? And even more specifically, how do I initiate my son? And as I've watched that, Jeff, what I observe is that question is mostly asked out of pressure, and below the pressure is fear. And if you could name the fear of what's driving it, it's often some version of, I'm scared because I cannot offer something I didn't receive and I do not have myself. I have never in 22 years had a man ask me, from the person that I've become, would you help me to know how to offer that to my child? That's intuitive. No one struggles with that. And I think fundamentally, when we can pull back from the trees and see the forest, we offer the sum total of who we've become. We will apprentice our kids for good or for ill into the person we've become. I was working with some leaders locally, and they were talking about this generation. It's a brutal age to be an adolescent girl. It's a brutal age. 2007 ushered in the smartphone. But statistically, the research is showing that 2009 is proving to be the most devastating mark soulfully for women in our culture, for adolescent women, age 13 to 15, because it wasn't the year of social media. It was the year where like and follow me came into being. And in that shift, it went from it's all about appearances of comparison, and there's isolation in the place of relationship, and comparison in the place of needing to feel belonging. And so I think that what I have found is we long to be loving fathers, but we put the cart before the horse, and we try to build structure, and we try to offer what we actually haven't yet received and offer what we haven't become. And when our kids are young, in some ways we can fake it and get away with sloppy a little bit. And I'm even learning, particularly the mother-daughter bond, or the mom-son, mom-daughter bond. I actually think I retract that statement. I don't think it can be fake. The intimacy that happens in utero and in the first 3 years is just fundamentally foundational. But for us fathers, we can fake it a little. But what happens is they read us. They read our body language. We can say the words, but they feel our stress. They feel our being there physically, but not emotionally. And the reason why I shared that about the cell phones is there's just this movement of young teenagers crying out when they can talk to a trustworthy person, and they say, My parents are on their phone. My parents are not available. And so it doesn't happen in the big ceremonies. Most of it happens in the moment with the blueberries and the brown berries.
Yeah.
It happens in the everyday, ordinary moments. It is quality time, and it's also quantity time. And there's no substitute for either.
Yeah.
The only way we can give quality time and quantity time is to become wholehearted, because as our kids mature, they will come to really experience, if our questions have been answered, if we truly have faith that's our foundation, if we are becoming wholehearted, and if we actually are growing in union with God. And so that's where I believe we can only fake it for so long. And until we come to an understanding that excavation is simply non-negotiable.
Yeah.
Because when we build on a shoddy foundation, we don't know till the storm comes, but the storm will come. We are in a culture of uncertainty, as you prayed before we got on this call, and we are in a time of shaking. And so this is a brilliant on-ramp to understand, as Hebrews says, what can be shaken and what cannot be shaken. And there is so much hope with the gospel that if we do the excavation, if we invite God to build us, we can lay a foundation that can weather any kind of storm that the world can throw our way.
Yeah. I appreciate how you talk about replacing a period or an exclamation point with a question mark.
Yes.
I'd love to
Yes.
ask the question, zip back 5-10 years into the past of your dad life. What areas were you putting periods or exclamation points that now you're like, that's a question mark now that I'm further forward? Can you give us some examples of those?
I had the answers for everything. I
Yeah.
had the answers for everything. I read the books. I'm a student.
Yep.
I'm like you. I'm just connecting with you, Jeff, and I can
Yeah.
tell you go for it,
Yeah.
right? And it's ready, fire, aim.
That's right.
Okay. There was a lot of my young, enthusiastic in marriage and parenting, ready, fire, aim. And that's okay. That's part of immaturity. And immaturity is different than sin. Jesus was immature. At 12, he was not thoughtful about his earthly parents. That wasn't sin, but it was immaturity. He had to mature. He had to grow in wisdom and stature and favor with God with man. Luke 2:52, right? Like that's a truth. So in our youth, I would name so much of the 20s is exploration and discovery. It's a time where when we're blessed and our hearts are well, we are intended to learn a little bit about a lot of things, gather data, try things on. It's low stakes. The risks feel big, but in proportion to what God wants to entrust us to his care in the future, they're small. And it's not until you become a dad, you become a husband, you realize, oh, that single life was a big deal, but it was a smaller deal than this deal, because you get catapulted out of the center of your story, right? You barely get a place in your story.
That's true.
Like it used to be an adventure trip, then it turns into an adventure day, and then you're happy to have 10 minutes. I remember walking out to the mailbox was amazing when I had little kids. It was like the part of my day I look forward to the most, besides drinking, was getting to my mailbox, because it was the one thing that I had for myself.
Sure.
Joshua cried and cried and cried. And I remember those days, the only places he didn't cry were in the bike trailer or the man bag, that feminine pouch that I wore to the park with all the other moms, because it's the only place he didn't cry. And so you come with exclamation points, that exploration, discovery. You think you have it all figured out, and that's okay. That's okay. That's being a young man. But then you bump your head. Dallas Willard says, I just love his fatherly voice. He says, reality is what we bump into when we're wrong.
Yep.
I ran into a glass wall with my face in a high-rise commercial building one time. I never saw it coming, and it hurt. And I looked like a raccoon for a week. Broke my nose, deviated septum. Oh. And I bumped into reality. And I could say there wasn't a glass wall there, but there was in fact, right? And it cost me my face. We get catapulted at the center of our story, and we have a decision. Now, most men, and this is so important, Jeff, because I remember when I sat with older men and they said, look at the older men in your life, 40s, 50s, 60s, and ask, where'd they get taken out, right? Where did they get hijacked? Where they lost and surrendered and yielded their true heart? And I remember thinking, I have a choice. I either have to settle for engineering a small life. That's what Brene Brown calls it, engineering smallness, where life becomes mostly about comfort, security, and arranging for a life that I can control, or at least have the illusion of control. And it doesn't require me to change. And that's what most men become. Or I can take those exclamation points and I can start asking questions. That's a risky endeavor because we are trained to be self-sufficient. We are trained to be experts. But I did. And over time, I learned from a mentor, we really have only two choices, either humility or humiliation. But there's not a third way in that regard. And so I chose humility after being humiliated enough and started asking questions. And I realized that questions are the core to apprenticeship. And it's the questions that led me back to the path of life.
And I do know some of your story about a decade of asking these questions that led to a place of not rejecting a culture's, like, there's a side of the mastery that is attractive. I want to be good at what, right? I want to take this area and thrive and be good and get to the top of my field. And I think just your journey, I'd love to hear a little bit about how you embrace that, but in God's timing, on God's path that led you to a place today of we're like 4 days away from book release to becoming a king. Would you talk about maybe the shorter version of that backstory? And then I want to get into talking about your book. So yeah, share that with us.
Sure. It's an upside down kingdom. So I found myself, my internal didn't match my external. I was a striving young dad that wanted to, and it looked good on the outside, right? We had a minivan and we shared a car for 6 years. I rode my bike, but our minivan was killer. Love that thing. And, 2 kids and meaningful work. And I wasn't well on the inside. I had fear. I had striving. It always felt like I was behind. I was always building something. My bank account, my ministry, my name. I wasn't well. And so I asked God, there is a mismatch between my internal life and my external. And I'm not okay with that anymore. And I want to offer out of integrity. What is the path of life? Where do I recover my joy? Cherie told me I lost my smile. And I had a big smile in high school. It wasn't doing the right things, but we had a hell of a lot of fun. Literally a hell of a lot of fun, okay? Like, I lost my smile. And God was silent for 2 weeks. And then, Jeff, he began speaking. And he said, I want to speak to you about this, but I want to do it through older men. So find the oldest men you know that you trust, that you respect in some way, and start asking the questions. And so I asked, what are the pitfalls? Where does a man lose his way? How do you become a loving husband and father? What is the most important thing? And counsel came back to me from distant countries or states. It was in the form of letters. Locally, it was a pint or a cigar by a campfire. Over 2 years, it was some 75 elders. And what I found, first off, I could feel in my body a shift. Yeah. The weight started coming off. I could just feel a sense from feeling a shift from being behind to feeling like I'm on time. A sense of someone bigger than me has this under control. Someone stronger than me is carrying this. Someone with my best interests in mind is at work. And so what I recovered was an upside down kingdom. And we talked about excavation where most men build. The invitation was to stop building and allow God to excavate so that he can build your character, not just morality, but wholeheartedness. That it was about choosing to forsake shortcuts and choose the long obedience in the same direction, to settle into the question asking, that slow and steady would actually win the race, that it's about taking the lowest seat at the table until God makes it impossible to do so. And that is not the way of the world. The way the world says burn, especially as a young single guy, like, or young married, no kids, like put some money aside, get your company going, get your calling going, get your graduate degrees. And that's not the way of the kingdom. And so I took a huge risk. I sabotaged reputation. I sabotaged influence. I sabotaged my side hustles to make a little money. And I put it all on God. And I put it all on apprenticeship. And what came were 2 decades of hidden years, 2 decades of the lower seat at the table, 2 decades of being apprenticed by seeking out older men, risking asking questions, being hurt, risking being hurt by men who were still uninitiated in some instances. But in all of it, what I found was a gospel worth living. What I found was a way of living that actually it's the good soil cultivated over time that yields the supernatural harvest. That the actual shortest path is the slow and steady. That actually doing the hard work, forsaking quick, cheap, and easy, we find joy, we find love, and we find a supernatural return on investment. And so you asked about my kids, and tomorrow, even though I'm missing the mark with my daughter, and I know I am, I'm also nailing it because I have her heart. She's showing up to me and I have access to her true self. And she knows I'm missing the mark and she's playful about it. And it's a game because we are together and she knows that she's kind of in charge of our relationship. And she knows that she has my delight. And that was from becoming. And so becoming a king is the fruit of that. Becoming a king was being entrusted with the care of a message, becoming the kind of person that can be entrusted. And in fact, my calling is the shapers and to be shaped by them. My calling is to be a leader. My calling is to help influence the men and women who are shaping the kingdom of God and recovering it in our generation. But it used to be where I turned for validation. It used to be the report card. And now I can say in ever increasing measure, my motive is love. My motive is to truly serve the greater body of other like-hearted. And so Becoming a King, the book, the video series, the study guide, and everything in Become Good Soil, all the podcasts and blog, it's simply the fruit of this way of living of 2 decades. It's stewarding what's been entrusted to my care. And truth be told, if you could see my secret life, you would see the cost. You would see the sacrifice. And just like you, we would want for no one's life but ours. We would only want the life intended by God for us, right? And so it's my sacred trust, and it's my way of reaching many to find the few that say, I'm all in for God. I'm all in. I want the way of the kingdom, and I'm not going to have a backup plan.
From day one of DadAwesome, we've prayed for the inside out dad life, a life that is focused on let's cultivate God's heart for our hearts, our identity as sons, way long before we start talking about tactics. So when I heard about your book, when I watched a few of these videos, curriculum videos, and I can't wait because again, we're a couple days away from the book launching. I'm going to pre-order, have the book, and we'll talk about all the ways to get that, plus your podcast. In fact, the episode about margin, I'm just gonna strongly recommend all of our listeners go listen to that because would you talk just big concept though about the gap there between capacity and talk about the concept.
Yeah, we're just in a fascinating moment in human history, and it's really hard because we're born into a world that we just think is normal. We have an incredible capacity to adapt, both for good or for ill. And Eugene Peterson says it's like a fish being in polluted water. How does a fish know its water is polluted? Because it simply has no reference point for other, right? I remember seeing a map of the world when I was a junior in college, and I was in England, and I was traveling, backpacking, looking for God. And I saw this map, and North America was way on the side, like way on the left side. And I remember my first thought was, oh, they cut the map wrong. Like when this came out of the printer, they cut it wrong, because I had never seen a map where America was not the center. And Jeff, I use that as a metaphor for the kingdom of God, right? We're born into a particular age in time and history, and America is not the center of the world. America is beautiful and it's important, but it's not the center of the world, and it's not the center of God's kingdom. But it was the center of the world in which I was born. Well, we were born in time and history. And yeah, I really recommend people listen to that podcast because it's very orienting for our age. And it's been something I've been exploring for a decade. But we live in an unprecedented time in human history, having nothing to do with COVID-19. And it's a 1.5% on average of all of humanity that is about progress. It's an age of exponential change. It's more and more, faster and faster. And the summarized result is simply this: we all, as a culture, carry more load than our limits. And so if, one man said it last week, he said, if I have 5 minutes, I find 8 minutes of stuff to fill it.
Sure.
Right? So no matter what, he's at a deficit. And so if we come to terms with we're in a very aggressive culture that wants to destroy margin, the gap between our load and our limits, then we understand then we have to respond to that, to have to fight to protect that space. And I think the last piece I'd add for here is I believe the great frontier in our age is our attention and our affection. And it's in margin. It's in the space between load and limits that we can recover our attention and our affection, which was actually meant to be the epicenter of where we grow in intimacy with God. And what I want to say to those dads out there, because your audience, there's a lot of young dads, and they're saying, what are you talking about? Like, margin isn't even in my language.
Right.
Like, are you kidding? I know. I was there. I walked to the mailbox and I called that solitude. Okay.
That's right.
But I want to say that God is pursuing us, and he is always at every moment making a very particular door to the narrow road, a narrow gate available to us. Joshua cried a lot when he was a newborn. And I'm an athletic person, and I ran a lot. And when I wore the man bag, I couldn't run. It was the first time in my life I walked, and I walked slowly, and I was exhausted, and I was sideways with this newborn. But God slowed me down and created the first piece of margin, a space between load and limits. And it was just enough. And so my encouragement to our friends out there is identify your load and identify your healthy, sustainable limits. And if your load exceeds your limits, then that's a frontier in which you need to be curious with about God.
Yeah. Morgan, I'd love for you to pray for all of us listening. But before you pray, I want us all to just envision for a second. I made a rope swing for my girls just a few days ago, and strung up this rope swing. And as a dad, I'm picking the line at which I'm swinging my girls. And there's a fence along that line, a chain link fence. And I can get this wrong and hurt them, or I can bring them immense pleasure and joy, and their eyes are shining and sparkling. And by our decisions around margin, our decisions around tending to our hearts, cultivating, again, a foundation before we build, all these topics we've talked about, our decisions are either bringing we're sending them into a great joy-filled, or we're causing hurt to our kids. So
Yeah.
just want to add that visual as you go into a time of praying. But I'm so thankful for you joining. And can you just say a prayer for all of us listening?
Yes. Yeah, God, we've covered a lot. We've covered a lot. And your yoke is easy and your burden is light. And Jesus, you entice us with this invitation where you say there's a way to come to you, to respond to your invitation, where we can learn to live slowly over time, more freely and more lightly. And so that's just first my prayer, just a blessing, just enacting your power, to be infused with your power for our friends out there to receive living more freely and more lightly in an unforced rhythm of grace. God, I'm impressed that there's a portion of this conversation with Jeff and with me today that's for today. So you listeners out there, God, whatever the peace is, Holy Spirit, what's the peace? What's the portion? What's the soul's portion that you're highlighting for today? And God, the rest of it, this is a sacred trust. And thank God that Jeff is stewarding a kingdom well with this podcast, and that it's something you can return to. And so I invite you to come back to this podcast again and again, to allow the work of deeper digging, of deep apprenticeship to go out of the shallows and into the deep waters. And Spirit of God, would you continue to minister to our friends, that we would be reminded that we want the things we want, God, because it's your image, it's your nature that's at the epicenter of our soul. And you are fully capable of providing for everything that you have set within our hearts. God, our infinite need is only matched by your infinite capacity and desire to respond to our need. And so, God, all of this, we give everyone and everything to you: spouses, children, our work in the world, our season, our questions. We give everyone and everything to you. And God, I pray in this moment, as I would invite you all, friends, to pray every day. There are no ordinary days, but there is one thing we can do every day before we even rise from our bed, to say, God, you are a father. You are my true father, and I am your son. And so today I choose to invite you to be my father. And I ask that you would father me today. I bless these men. I bless them with vitality, with strength, and with life. In Jesus' name, amen.